He's too old for the family business anymore. My own sons voted me out. A former employee bought my shares back. They didn't call me into that boardroom to ask my opinion. They called me in to read me a resolution they'd already drafted, already circulated, already secured enough votes for before I'd even sat down. My own sons said I was too old for the business I built with my own two hands. A woman I'd trained on a shop floor 30 years ago heard about it within the week, and she didn't wait to be asked before she did something about it. I'm 71 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. This isn't a story about a company. It's a story about which relationships in your life were ever really built on gratitude, and which ones were only ever built on what you could still provide. Let me back up. I live outside Portland, Oregon, in a house I bought 40 years ago with the first real profit Kerrigan Millworks ever turned. Back when it was a single second-hand sawmill and a line of credit, I'd talked a skeptical banker into against every reasonable instinct he had. I built that company from nothing, starting with rough lumber and a handful of employees. I paid out of my own savings some weeks when the invoices ran late, into a business that, by the time my sons took over daily operations a decade ago, employed better than 90 people and supplied custom millwork to builders across 3 states. I remember the early years of that mill with a clarity that surprises me, given how much time has passed. I bought that first second-hand sawmill with money I'd saved working as a lumber grader for another company. 26 years old with a young wife and a newborn son, Bradley, and a business plan that most reasonable people would have called reckless. My wife Elaine used to help with the books on weekends before Bradley was old enough to need constant watching, and I remember thinking, those early years, that I was building something not just for myself, but for a family that would eventually inherit it, run it, carry it forward long after I was gone. Elaine passed 12 years ago, cancer that moved faster than any of us expected, and I think, looking back, that her absence changed something in how Bradley and Todd related to the business, and to me, in ways none of us fully understood at the time. She'd always been the one who kept the family conversations grounded in something beyond quarterly numbers, who reminded all 3 of us gently but firmly that Kerrigan Millworks existed to support a family, not the other way. I don't think either of my sons consciously decided to lose sight of that after she was gone. I think it just happened slowly, the way most drift happens, one efficiency-minded decision at a time. I remember, in particular, a Sunday dinner Elaine used to insist on every single week, rain or shine, business trip or no business trip. Both boys required to attend regardless of how busy they claimed to be. She'd sit at the head of that table and ask each of us, one at a time, what had actually mattered to us that week, not what we'd accomplished, what had mattered, and I remember how patiently she'd wait through Bradley's early attempts to answer with production numbers before gently redirecting him towards something more honest. Those dinners stopped within a year of her passing, first monthly, then just holidays, until eventually they existed only as a memory the 3 of us rarely spoke about directly. Welcome to Brian's Revenge. If that opening's already sitting heavy in your chest, that's exactly where I need you. Hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from, and stay with me, because what happened over the following weeks is going to show you exactly who actually valued what I built, and who only ever valued what it could still do for them. My sons, Bradley and Todd, grew up on that shop floor the way I grew up on it myself, sweeping sawdust before they were old enough to run a single machine, learning the business the way I always hoped they would. I handed daily operations to them 10 years ago, Bradley taking over as Chief Operating Officer and Todd managing the finances, and I stayed on as chairman, mostly ceremonial by then, showing up a few days a week, offering advice when asked, staying out of the way when I understood correctly that a new generation needed room to run things their own way. I remember the day I formally handed over operations, a small ceremony in the same boardroom where, a decade later, they'd read me that resolution. Bradley and Todd, both younger then, more earnest, genuinely excited about the responsibility rather than burdened by having to still consult me on anything. I remember feeling, that day, a pride so complete it nearly brought me to tears in front of the whole management team, watching two boys I'd raised on that shop floor step into the exact kind of stewardship I'd always hoped Kerrigan Millworks would eventually receive. Bradley threw himself into operations with an intensity that reminded me of myself at his age. Long hours, genuine care for the craftsmen on the floor, a real talent for solving the kind of production problems that used to keep me up at night in the early years. Todd took to the financial side with a different kind of intensity, more abstract, more focused on the kind of efficiency metrics that look impressive on paper, but sometimes miss the texture of what actually makes a company like ours worth running in the first place. I told myself, for years, that their different strengths complemented each other well, that together they were building something even more capable than what I'd managed alone. I want to be fair here, because fairness has mattered to me my whole life, even when it hasn't been returned. My sons aren't cruel men, not in any way you'd recognize from the outside. They're ambitious, modern, focused on margins and efficiency in ways that sometimes made me wince, but that I understood mostly, as simply how business gets done differently now than it did when I was building this company by hand. The trouble started, though I didn't understand it as trouble at the time, about 4 months ago, when Bradley and Todd began pushing for an aggressive expansion into prefabricated modular construction, a direction I had real reservations about, having watched two competitors overextend into exactly that market and collapse within 18 months when demand shifted. I voiced those reservations in board meetings, carefully, respectfully, the way a chairman is supposed to voice concerns rather than issue commands, and I watched, over those 4 months, my sons grow steadily less patient with hearing them. I remember the specific meeting where the tension first became impossible to ignore, roughly 2 months before the boardroom vote, Bradley presenting a detailed financial model projecting the modular expansion's returns, genuinely impressive work, the kind of analysis I could never have produced myself at his age. I raised my concerns anyway, mentioned the two competitors by name, walked through exactly what had gone wrong for each of them, and I watched Bradley's expression shift from professional patience into something closer to barely suppressed frustration. "Dad," he'd said, that evening with respect, "those companies failed because of execution problems, not because the market itself was flawed. We're not going to make the same operational mistakes they made." "Maybe not," I told him. "But you're asking this company to take on debt exposure larger than anything we've carried in 40 years of operation, based on a market that's still unproven at the scale you're proposing. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying let's move more carefully than the timeline you're proposing." That conversation, and several like it over the following weeks, never became openly hostile, not in any way I could point to directly. But I felt something shifting in how my son spoke to me during that stretch, a growing impatience just beneath the surface of every otherwise polite exchange, the particular frustration of two men who'd already decided on a direction and simply needed their father to either get on board or get out of the way. I found out much later, from a sympathetic board member who reached out privately after everything came to light, that Bradley and Todd had actually begun quietly building support for the emeritus resolution nearly 6 weeks before that final Tuesday meeting, individual conversations with other board members, careful framing of my concerns as evidence of declining relevance rather than legitimate business caution. I want you to sit with that timeline, the way I had to sit with it once I learned it. My own son spent 6 weeks building a case against me before ever once sitting me down directly to have an honest conversation about their concerns. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments which one of my relationships you think turned out to matter, because I promise you, it wasn't the one built on shared blood. The board meeting where it happened was scheduled, I later learned, specifically for a Tuesday when I'd mentioned, weeks earlier, that I might be traveling to visit my sister in Sacramento, a trip I ultimately postponed without telling anyone, which meant I walked into that boardroom that morning with no idea a resolution had already been drafted, circulated among the other board members, and quietly secured enough support to pass regardless of anything I said once I sat down. I remember that morning clearly, arriving 15 minutes early the way I always did, expecting an ordinary quarterly review, chatting briefly with our longtime office manager about her grandson's upcoming graduation before heading into the boardroom itself. I noticed, almost immediately upon sitting down, a particular carefulness in how the other board members greeted me, an outside investor named Carl Weathers who avoided meeting my eyes directly, our longtime family attorney sitting closer to Bradley's end of the table than his usual seat beside mine. I understood, in retrospect, that everybody else in that room had known exactly what was coming, and I'd been the only person left genuinely uninformed about my own fate. I remember, too, the particular detail of the coffee that morning, our office manager bringing in the same tray she always brought, the same chipped mug I'd used in that boardroom for going on 2 decades, and how strange it felt, sitting there sipping from that familiar mug, to realize the room around it had already quietly decided I no longer belonged in it the way I always had. Sometimes it's the smallest details that stay with you longest, not the resolution itself, but the ordinary chipped mug that made the extraordinary betrayal feel, for one disorienting moment, almost normal. Bradley read the resolution himself, his voice carefully professional, the voice he uses, I imagine, with vendors he's about to renegotiate hard terms with. Dad, the board has voted to restructure the chairman role going forward, transitioning you to an emeritus advisory position without voting authority. This isn't about disrespect. It's about making sure Kerrigan Millworks can move at the speed the market demands, without being slowed down by, and I remember this phrase exactly, outdated instincts. Outdated instincts. That's what my own son called 40 years of building this company from a single sawmill, sitting in a boardroom I'd once held meetings in around a card table because we couldn't afford real furniture yet. I asked him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, whether this meant I'd been removed from the board entirely or simply stripped of my vote. Todd answered instead, his tone carrying the particular smoothness of a man who'd rehearsed this part of the conversation. Dad, under the original shareholder agreement, board members transition to emeritus status are required to divest their voting shares within 90 days, at a valuation set by an independent appraisal. It's standard practice. It protects the company's ability to move forward cleanly. I sat there in that boardroom, in the company I'd built with my own hands, and understood, in the space of about 4 minutes, that my own sons had engineered a way to force me out entirely, dressed up in language careful enough that neither of them would ever have to say the actual words out loud. I want you to sit with what it feels like, sitting in a room you helped design the layout of decades earlier, listening to your own children explain, in careful corporate language, exactly how thoroughly you've become someone to be managed rather than consulted. I didn't argue that day. I want you to understand why. I could see, looking around that table, that every vote necessary had already been secured, that any objection I raised in that moment would only cost me dignity without changing a single outcome. I sat quietly through the rest of that meeting, said very little, and drove home afterward with both hands shaking on the wheel in a way they hadn't shaken since Elaine's diagnosis 12 years earlier. Welcome back to Brian's Revenge if you're just joining us. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what happened over the following weeks, from a woman who owed this family absolutely nothing, is the reason I'm sitting here telling you any of this at all. Ruth Alvarez started at Kerrigan Mill Works 31 years ago, 17 years old, sweeping the same shop floor sawdust my own sons would eventually sweep. The daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment across town. I saw something in Ruth almost immediately, a sharpness, a hunger to actually understand how things worked rather than just do the tasks in front of her. And I spent the better part of 6 years personally mentoring her, teaching her everything from basic joinery to the financial fundamentals of running a shop floor efficiently, the same way somebody had once mentored me. I remember the first time I noticed that hunger in Ruth clearly, maybe 3 months into her employment, catching her after hours studying an old joinery manual I kept in my office, not because anyone had assigned it to her, but because she'd asked a question during her shift that I hadn't been able to fully answer on the spot, and she decided, on her own initiative, to find the answer herself rather than let the question go. I gave her that manual outright, told her to keep it, and over the following years I made a point of teaching her things well beyond what her actual job required, understanding even then that I was looking at somebody genuinely gifted rather than simply a good employee. I remember, too, a particular winter. Ruth may be 20 years old by then, when her mother fell seriously ill, and Ruth found herself suddenly responsible for medical bills far beyond anything she never once asked me for help, too proud, I think, in the particular way young people sometimes are when they've spent their whole lives being the one who takes care of others rather than the one who receives care. I found out about the situation from another employee, and I quietly arranged additional hours for her, structured in a way that let her earn the money she needed without ever having to ask directly for charity she wouldn't have accepted anyway. I never told her I don't know if she ever fully realized, but I think, looking back now, that moment planted something in both of us, an understanding of what it actually means to show up for somebody without making them feel the weight of needing help in the first place. Ruth left Kerrigan Mill Works 18 years ago to start her own custom furniture business, a decision I supported fully at the time, told her, honestly, that I'd taught her everything I knew specifically so she could eventually build something of her own instead of staying in my shadow forever. Alvarez and Company grew slowly and steadily over those 18 years, the same way Kerrigan Mill Works had grown under me decades earlier. And by the time this story starts, Ruth's business had become genuinely successful in its own right, respected across the same regional market Kerrigan Mill Works operated in. Competitors in name only, since Ruth and I had stayed close friends the entire time, meeting for coffee every few months, calling each other for advice neither of us needed but both of us valued anyway. I remember, in particular, the day Ruth called to tell me she'd landed her first major commercial contract, 6 years into running Alvarez and Company, her voice shaking with an excitement she hadn't let herself fully feel until she'd confirmed the signed paperwork was real. I drove out to her small workshop that same afternoon, brought a bottle of good whiskey neither of us particularly needed an excuse to open, and I remember telling her, watching her walk me through the details of that contract, that watching her build something entirely her own had become one of the genuine joys of my later years, a pride that sat alongside my pride in my own sons rather than competing with it. I hadn't told Ruth about the boardroom vote, ashamed in a way I didn't fully understand myself. Some old, stubborn piece of me not wanting even my closest friend to see me as a man who'd just been quietly pushed out of his own life's work by his own sons. She found out anyway, the way news travels in a regional industry small enough that everybody eventually hears everything, a mutual supplier mentioning it to her almost in passing during an otherwise. She called me that same evening, her voice carrying an edge I rarely heard from her. "Desmond, is it true? Did your own sons actually force you out?" I told her the truth, the whole embarrassing shape of it, the 90-day divestment clause, the independent appraisal already scheduled, the careful, bloodless language my sons had used to avoid ever having to say plainly that they decided their own father had become an obstacle to move around rather than a person to still include. Ruth was quiet a long moment after I finished. "Desmond," she finally said, "what's that appraisal going to value your shares at?" I told her the rough estimate Todd had mentioned, a number that reflected, I now understood, a valuation methodology designed to come in as low as legally defensible, the kind of number a company uses when it wants a forced sale to cost as little as possible. "That's not even close to fair market value, Desmond," she said, and I could hear in her voice the particular sharpness she gets when she's already 3 steps ahead of a problem most people haven't finished describing yet. If this story's got a knot forming in your stomach already, that's exactly where I need you to be. Because what Ruth did over the following weeks is the reason this story doesn't end the way my sons assumed it would. My health had been giving me some trouble that same stretch, nothing connected to the boardroom vote, just an aging heart finally announcing itself the way aging hearts eventually do. A cardiologist recommending a procedure that came with an out-of-pocket cost my sudden uncertain financial position made considerably harder to absorb than it should have been for a man who, 3 months earlier, had been chairman of a company worth tens of millions of dollars. I remember sitting in that cardiologist's office, a careful woman named Dr. Fenwick explaining the procedure's specifics, and feeling a strange, disorienting layering of 2 separate griefs at once, the fear any man feels hearing his heart needs intervention, and underneath it, a colder, more specific grief about exactly how thoroughly my own financial security had been upended by a boardroom vote I hadn't been able to contest in real time. "Dr. Fenwick asked me, near the end of that appointment, whether I had family who could help manage my recovery once the procedure was scheduled. A routine question I imagine she asks every patient my age, and I remember the particular hollowness I felt answering it. Technically, yes, 2 grown sons, both financially capable, both currently treating my medical crisis as a line item awaiting resolution of an unrelated corporate matter. I didn't say any of that to Dr. Finn. I just told her I'd manage, the way you tell a stranger you'll manage when the honest answer is considerably more complicated than a waiting room conversation allows for. I called Bradley about it, mostly out of old habit, some part of me still expecting a son to show concern for his father's heart even after everything else that had happened. He was sympathetic in the careful, distant way he'd been sympathetic about everything since that boardroom meeting. "Dad, I'm sorry. Once the share divestment closes, you'll have plenty of liquidity to cover it. I just don't think it makes sense for the company to advance anything before that's finalized, given the circumstances. My own son, discussing my heart surgery like a line item pending resolution of an unrelated transaction." I called Ruth that same evening, ashamed in a way I hadn't expected to feel calling a friend rather than a family member, and she cut me off before I'd gotten more than a few sentences into explaining the situation. Desmond, stop. What do you need and by when? Ruth, I can't ask you to, you're not asking. I'm asking you. She was already moving, I could hear it in her voice, drawers opening, a pen clicking. I'll wire you what you need for the procedure today. We'll figure out. I remember sitting in my kitchen after that call, phone still in my hand, thinking about how completely backward the whole situation had become. A woman I'd once mentored for a fraction of what a father owes a son, offering, without hesitation, exactly the kind of immediate, unconditional support my own sons had just spent an entire phone call carefully avoiding. If you're still with me, that tells me something about you. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss where this one goes. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Ruth did next is the reason a boardroom's careful, bloodless resolution didn't end up being the last word on any of this. Ruth didn't just cover the procedure. She spent the following 3 weeks, almost entirely on her own initiative, having her own company's general counsel review the original Kerrigan Millworks shareholder agreement, the same document Todd had cited as justification for the forced divestment, looking for anything that might complicate what my sons clearly assumed was a clean, uncontestable process. I found out later, from Ruth's own general counsel, that she'd actually paused 2 of her own company's active projects that same week to personally sit in on every review session, unwilling to simply delegate something this important to somebody else, wanting to understand every detail herself before bringing anything to me. That's who Ruth is. She doesn't do things halfway, and she doesn't ask other people to carry weight she's not willing to carry herself first. The surgery went well, a straightforward procedure, clean recovery, and Ruth drove me home herself. Stayed the first 2 days checking on me with the same steady attentiveness I remembered from watching her learn joinery on that shop floor 3 decades earlier. Patient, thorough, unwilling to move forward until she genuinely understood every piece of what she was working with. It was on the 3rd day of my recovery, sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of printouts her attorney had compiled, that Ruth told me what they'd found. Desmond, she said, this original shareholder agreement, the one from when you incorporated the company 40 years ago, it's got a provision buried in Section 11 that nobody currently on your board seems to have accounted for. It states that any forced divestment of founder shares, and you're explicitly named as founder in the original filing, triggers a right of first refusal for any shareholder who held equity in the company prior to its first outside investment round. Desmond, that's me. I bought a small equity stake from you 15 years ago, remember, when you helped me structure Alvarez and Company's initial financing, and I insisted on investing back into Kerrigan Millworks as a thing. I never sold that stake. I still hold it. I remember sitting there at my own kitchen table, still sore from surgery, trying to piece together a memory I'd genuinely forgotten existed. Ruth insisting 15 years earlier that she wanted to invest something back into the company that had given her a start. Me signing off on it almost absent-mindedly at the time, treating it as a sentimental gesture between old friends rather than anything with lasting legal weight. I remembered slowly the actual afternoon she'd made that investment, sitting in my old office with a check she'd clearly saved toward for months, insisting, over my own objections, that she didn't need to do this, that she wanted a real stake in the place that had shaped her, however small, however symbolic it felt to both of us at the time. I want you to understand what it felt like, sitting at my own kitchen table 3 days after heart surgery, hearing a woman I'd mentored 31 years earlier explain that a small, sentimental investment she'd made 15 years ago had just become the mechanism that could unwind everything my sons had spent months carefully engineering. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I didn't call Bradley. I didn't call Todd. I want you to remember that because it matters for what comes later. I never went looking for a way to fight my own sons. I'd spent months assuming, the way you assume when your own children present something with enough confident, careful language, that they'd handled it properly, that there was nothing left to contest. I simply stopped assuming that, once a woman who owed this family nothing proved otherwise. Ruth's attorney confirmed the provision's validity within a week, walked us through exactly what it meant. Because Ruth held a right of first refusal on any forced divestment of founder shares, she had the legal standing to purchase my shares directly, at the same appraised valuation my sons had arranged, before those shares could be forced onto the open market or absorbed back into company treasury, the way Todd's plan clearly intended. I asked Ruth's attorney, my voice not entirely steady, whether my sons could have any legal recourse to challenge this once it became public. He was quiet a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Kerrigan, the provision is unambiguous and properly filed. Your son's legal counsel should have caught this during their review before drafting the resolution. That's an oversight on their side, not a vulnerability on Ruth's. I don't see meaningful grounds for them to unwind this transaction." I asked him, too, what it would mean practically, once the transfer went through, for the balance of power on the board itself. He explained that Ruth's newly acquired stake, combined with her formal standing as a shareholder predating the company's first outside investment round, entitled her to a board seat of her own if she chose to claim it. An entitlement neither Bradley nor Todd had any legal mechanism to block, however uncomfortable they might find having someone entirely outside the family suddenly holding meaningful influence over decisions they'd assumed, until 3 weeks earlier, belonged. "Ruth," I said, sitting across from her at that same kitchen table, "are you telling me you want to actually buy my shares?" "I'm telling you I already have," she said, sliding a completed transaction summary across the table toward me. "Effective yesterday. Desmond, I didn't do this to take anything from you. I did it because the moment I understood there was a legal path that kept those shares out of your son's hands entirely, I wasn't going to let that window close." I sat there staring at that transaction summary a long while, understanding, gradually, exactly what Ruth had done. She hadn't just bought my forced-out shares at a discount. She'd become, overnight, a significant minority shareholder in Kerrigan Millworks herself, with voting rights my sons had never once considered might end up in the hands of somebody outside the family entirely. "What do you want to do with them?" I asked her. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "That's actually a question I wanted to ask you, Desmond. This is your company. I bought these shares to protect what you built, not to run it myself. Whatever you want to do with the voting power they represent, I'll back you completely. I want you to sit with that offer the way I had to sit with it, understanding that a woman with no legal obligation to me at all had just handed me back a meaningful piece of the leverage my own sons thought they'd permanently removed from my hands." Ruth, I want to move on this carefully," I told her. "I don't want either of my sons knowing what's happened until we understand exactly how to use it." "They are going to find out eventually," Ruth said. "There's a public filing requirement for a share transfer this size. Let them find out through the filing," I said. "I'm not interested in calling ahead to warn them. They didn't call ahead to warn me either." "I hear you, Desmond," Ruth said. "I'll make sure everything's structured exactly the way you want it before that filing goes public." I sat there in my kitchen a long while after she left that evening, thinking about a 17-year-old girl sweeping sawdust off a shop floor 31 years ago, about a company I'd built from a single secondhand sawmill, about 2 sons who'd apparently decided, somewhere in the last decade, that the man who built all of it had become an obstacle rather than a foundation. They're going to find out eventually, I thought. And when they do, they're not going to ask how my recovery's going. They're going to ask about the shares. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are, and I think you're going to want to see how Bradley and Todd find out. Because they don't find out from me. They find out the way people in their position usually find out, through a routine corporate filing that lands on their own general counsel's desk, with considerably more weight behind it than either of them ever expected their father's forced exit to produce. 9 days after Ruth's purchase closed, Bradley called me at 7 in the evening, his voice carrying a tightness I recognized right away. "Dad, I need you to explain something to me. Our counsel flagged a share transfer filing today. Ruth Alvarez acquired a significant block of your former voting shares. Dad, what is going on? Did you sell to her deliberately to spite us?" "I didn't sell anything to spite anyone, Bradley," I said, steady. "Ruth exercised a right of first refusal that's been sitting in our original shareholder agreement since the day I incorporated this company, 40 years ago, long before either of you were old enough to have an opinion about how it should be run." "That's not possible," he said, his voice climbing slightly. "Our counsel reviewed that agreement before we drafted the resolution. Nobody flagged that provision." "Then your counsel missed it," I said, "or didn't think to look closely enough at a 40-year-old document because you were all in a hurry to make sure I couldn't contest anything before it was already decided." There was a long silence on the line. "I want to meet," Bradley finally said, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Both of us with Todd, please, Dad." I remember sitting with that request for the better part of a day before responding, weighing whether I was actually ready to face my sons directly, whether hearing whatever explanation they'd prepared was worth the emotional cost of revisiting that boardroom betrayal in person. Ruth, when I called to ask her opinion, told me the decision was entirely mine to make, that she'd support whatever I chose, but that she thought, if I felt strong enough for it, sitting down with them properly might give the whole situation a chance to actually heal rather than simply calcify into permanent estrangement. I decided to meet them, on my own terms, in a place that meant something to me rather than anywhere that might feel like their territory. We met 3 days later, not in the boardroom where they'd read me that resolution, but at my request, at the original mill site itself, the small original building still standing on the property, converted years ago into a modest museum of sorts, old tools and photographs documenting the company's earliest years, a space my sons rarely had reason to visit anymore. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Bradley and Todd arrived together, both still in their work clothes, and I watched them take in that small building glass cases full of the original tools I'd used to build the first pieces of furniture Kerrigan Millworks ever sold. Photographs of a much younger version of me standing beside a single secondhand sawmill with an expression somewhere between terror and determination. "Dad," Bradley said, standing near a case containing the actual hand plane I'd used on my very first commission piece, "we need to understand what's actually going on here. This isn't how we wanted any of this to go." "How did you want it to go, Bradley?" I asked, steady. "I'm curious to hear that part." He didn't have an easy answer for that. He stood there a long moment, looking at that old hand plane, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier "Dad, honestly, we thought we were protecting the company. We watched you resist the modular expansion for months, and we told ourselves you'd lost touch with where the market was actually heading. We told ourselves the emeritus transition was the responsible thing to do for the business, not really thinking hard enough about what it would actually mean for you personally. I appreciate you saying that honestly," I told him. "I don't think either of you sat in that boardroom intending outright cruelty. I think you convinced yourselves efficiency and love could be separated cleanly, that you could remove me from decision-making without it meaning anything about how much you valued me as your father. I don't think that's true, Bradley. I don't think it's ever true. Todd spoke up then, quieter than I'd heard him in years. Dad, what happens now with Ruth holding those shares? Is she going to try to take control of the company? Ruth doesn't want control of this company, I said. She told me herself. She bought those shares to protect what I built, not to run it. But I want both of you to understand something important. She could have. The law gave her that option, and she chose not to use it that way, purely out of loyalty to a man who mentored her 31 years ago and never once asked for anything in return. I want you to sit with that. A woman with no blood relation to this family showed more loyalty in a single decision than the family itself managed across an entire boardroom meeting. Bradley's jaw tightened at that, and I watched him absorb it, some old defensiveness warring visibly with something closer to genuine shame. "That's not fair, Dad," he started, and then stopped himself, seeming to hear his own words the way I imagine he'd have heard them from anyone else defending a decision like the one he and "Is it not fair?" I asked. "Or does it just feel unfair to hear it said out loud?" He didn't answer right away. He walked slowly along that case of old photographs instead, stopping in front of one taken maybe 35 years ago, a much younger version of himself as a small boy, sitting on my shoulders in front of the mill's original building, both of us grinning at whoever was holding the camera. "I don't remember hating this place, Dad," he said, quiet almost to himself. "I don't remember ever wanting anything except to make you proud of what we built together. I want you to understand what it did to me, hearing my own son say that, standing in the very building where I'd first taught him to hold a hammer properly. I still want that, Bradley," I told him, my voice not entirely steady now either. "I've always wanted that. I just also want to still be included in the building, not managed around like a liability once the market shifted towards something I had honest reservations about." Todd finally spoke again, his voice careful. "Dad, what do you want to happen next? With the company, with the board, with all of it?" "I want the emeritus resolution reversed," I said. "Not because I need to run daily operations again. I don't. You've both earned that role and I trust you with it. But I want my full voting rights restored, and I want it understood clearly by this entire board, that removing a founder isn't a clerical matter to be handled quietly on a Tuesday when he happens to be traveling. And I want Ruth's position on this board formalized properly, not as a favor to me, but because she's earned it, both through what she built at Alvarez and Company, and through what she did for this one without being asked." Bradley and Todd looked at each other for a long moment, some silent negotiation passing between them, the way it always has since they were boys working out who'd take the blame for something they'd both been part of. "We can do that," Todd finally said. "All of it. I think we need to do all of it, honestly, Dad, whether you'd asked for it or not." There was a longer silence after that, none of us quite ready to leave that small building yet, and I found myself studying my sons in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in months, looking past the careful business language both of them had grown so fluent in, trying to find the two boys who used to sit at Elaine's Sunday dinner table, answering honestly about what had actually mattered to them that week. "Dad," Bradley said, breaking that silence, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was young enough to still ask me for help with things he was afraid to admit he couldn't do alone. "I keep thinking about something Mom used to say, about how this company was supposed to support the family, not the other way around. I think somewhere in these last few years, Todd and I got that backward without ever quite meaning to. I think you did too," I told him gently. "I think grief does that sometimes, to people who don't fully know how to carry it. Your mother would have caught this drift months before it ever reached a boardroom. I understand why neither of you had her instincts for it. I just wish I'd trusted my own instincts sooner, instead of assuming careful business language always meant careful business thinking. Todd wiped at his eyes, not quite hiding it, and I realized watching him that I hadn't seen my younger son cry since. Dad, I don't know how to fix all of this in one conversation. I know that. But I want you to know, whatever this board vote looked like from the outside, it never once meant we stopped loving you. We just got so focused on protecting the business that we forgot the business existing was never actually the point. I stood there a long moment, letting that land, letting myself actually feel it instead of guarding against it the way I'd been guarding against everything since that too. I know that, Todd, I finally said. I've known that the whole time, somewhere underneath how much it hurt. That's actually why this hurt as much as it did. If I didn't believe you both still loved me, this would have just been a business dispute. Instead, it felt like losing something much larger than a boardroom vote. Bradley stepped closer then, an old, familiar gesture from childhood, the way he used to stand close to me in that same building decades earlier, whenever he wanted reassurance about something he was nervous about. Dad, can we start over? Not erase what happened, I don't think that's honest or possible, but actually start over, the right way this time. I looked at both my sons for a long moment, thinking about Ruth's steady, unasked loyalty, about a boardroom resolution drafted specifically for a day I wasn't expected to be present, about the particular difference between a family that assumes love and a friendship that proves it, and about the possibility, however uncertain, that a family capable of this much honest reckoning might still find its way back to something worth trusting. I'd like that, I told them both. I want you to understand, it's going to take longer than one conversation in this old building to actually rebuild the trust that boardroom took apart. But yes, I want to try. I looked at both of my sons for a long moment, standing in that small building surrounded by the physical history of everything I'd built, thinking about Ruth's steady, unasked loyalty, about a boardroom resolution drafted specifically for a day I wasn't expected to be present, about the particular difference between a family that assumes love and a friendship that proves it. I've thought a great deal, in the days since that conversation, about what it actually means to be owed loyalty by the people who share your blood, versus what it means to receive it freely from somebody who owes you nothing legally binding at all. My sons owed me, by every reasonable measure of gratitude, more consideration than they showed me in that boardroom. It took a 40-year-old contract clause and a friend's fierce, immediate loyalty to remind them what that consideration should have looked like from the start. Ruth owed me nothing beyond the debt of old mentorship, freely given decades ago with no expectation of return. She gave everything anyway, the moment it actually mattered. I think often, these days, about the particular arithmetic of family, how easily we assume it operates differently than every other relationship in our lives, that blood alone guarantees a kind of loyalty friendship has to actually earn moment by moment. I don't think that's true, not really, though I spent most of my life believing it without examining it closely. I think family can absolutely provide that loyalty, at its best, the way Elaine provided it every single Sunday at that dinner table for decades. But I think family can also drift, quietly, one efficiency-minded decision at a time, into something that only resembles love from a comfortable distance, until a boardroom resolution reveals exactly how much distance had actually grown. I think, too, about Ruth, 17 years old sweeping sawdust off a shop floor 31 years ago, and about how strange it is that the truest inheritance I ever passed down wasn't the company itself, but the values I taught a young woman who had no legal claim to any of it. Bradley and Todd inherited Kerrigan Millworks. Ruth inherited something else entirely, the understanding of what it actually means to show up for somebody who once showed up for you. And in the end, That inheritance turned out to matter more than any share certificate ever could. What I know for certain is this: the families we build through blood don't automatically outrank the families we build through choice, through mentorship, through decades of showing up for each other without anyone keeping score. Sometimes the person who protects what you've built isn't the one who inherited a stake in it. Sometimes it's the one who once swept your floors, learned everything you were willing to teach, and never once forgot what that meant. Because what I told them next, standing in that old mill building surrounded by tools I'd once used with my own hands to build something my sons had tried to quietly take from me, is a conversation that changes everything about what Kerrigan Millworks and my own family are about to understand happened here. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, right there in that old mill building, and it does not go the way either of my sons walked in expecting.